Elowen Vance had been rejected by 11 noble houses before the sun reached its highest point, and she had stopped flinching by the 9th. She stood at the edge of the choosing rite's stone courtyard, her patched gray cloak drawn tight against the mountain wind, and watched the 12th banner, a silver hawk on a field of green, the sigil of House Marrow, dip once in her direction, then turn away. No words were needed. In the kingdom of Velorn, a banner that dipped and turned meant not this one, not ever. She had counted the dips since dawn. 11 now. Soon it would be 12. The choosing rite happened once every 7 years, when every wolf of marriageable age who carried no house of their own gathered in the shadow of Duskmere Keep, hoping some noble family would claim them as kin by adoption, by marriage, by any bond that would end the particular loneliness of being what the old tongue called unhoused, a wolf with no pack, no banner, no name that meant anything beyond the one stitched into an orphanage ledger. Elowen had worn that word her whole life. Unhoused. Hollow-blooded. The strays word for themselves, said with a shrug that was supposed to look braver than it felt. She was 23, and she had been raised in the kennel, the charity house on the low side of Duskmere, where children of no lineage were fed, taught to read, and told, gently but firmly, that they should not expect much. She had grown up fast and quiet, with amber eyes that turned gold when her wolf pressed close to the surface, and a habit of counting things. Steps, breaths, coins, refusals. Because numbers didn't lie to you the way people sometimes did. 11 houses had looked at her file, glanced at her face, and moved their banners on. She understood why. Her blood carried no housemark. Her lineage records ended abruptly 19 years ago, in the year the old histories called the Ashgrave Rebellion, when an entire noble house had been erased from Velorn's rolls in a single terrible night. Nobody adopted a name from nowhere. Nobody wanted an heir with no ancestors to vouch for her. She should not have come today. She told herself that every year, and every year she came anyway, because the alternative, sitting in the kennel's common room while the other strays trickled back with new house pins on their collars, was worse. The wind shifted, carrying wood smoke and the mineral tang of the mountain that Duskmere Keep was carved into. Somewhere above the courtyard, a bell began to toll. 3 low notes, then silence. The crowd's murmur died with it. "He's coming out," someone whispered near her. "The king never comes out for the rite. Not since—" "Hush," someone else said, and the whisperer hushed. Elowen had heard the stories, the way everyone in Velorn had heard them, retold so many times they'd gone smooth and strange like riverstones. 10 years ago, King Ronan Blackwood had been crowned Alpha of all 9 houses, in a ceremony that should have ended with him speaking the sovereign's oath, the binding words that gave a new king the voice, the ability to command every wolf in the kingdom through the Pact bond, the way his father and his father's father had before him. He had opened his mouth to speak the oath. No sound had come out. None had come out since. The physicians called it a malady of the throat. The priests called it a trial sent by the moon to test his worthiness. The Council of 9, the regents who had ruled in his silent stead for a decade, called it, with great sorrow and greater convenience, a tragedy that required their continued guidance. Elowen had never seen him. Almost no one outside the keep had, not in 10 years. He did not attend festivals. He did not walk the lower city. He was a name on proclamations that his council wrote and he, presumably, approved. A shadow at a high window that children pointed to and called the Quiet King, half myth, half warning. Now the great doors of Duskmere Keep were opening, and a hush moved through the courtyard like weather. He was taller than the stories allowed for. That was Elowen's first thought. Absurd and immediate, that a decade of rumor had somehow failed to account for the simple physical fact of him, black-haired, dressed in unadorned charcoal wool with no crown, no house sash, nothing to mark him as anything but a very large, very still man, descending the keep's stone steps, as if he had done it 1,000 times, and enjoyed none of them. His eyes found the crowd and moved across it the way a man reads a room he doesn't trust. Beside her, a girl from the kennel, Tansy, younger than Elowen by 6 years, still hopeful in the way only someone who hadn't been refused 11 times yet could afford to be, grabbed Elowen's sleeve. Why would he come down for a stray's rite? He never comes down. Elowen didn't answer. She was watching House Draven's banner, black and silver, held by a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, whose face she'd learned to recognize from proclamation woodcuts. Lord Alistair Draven, first among the Council of 9, the man who had, by most accounts, run the kingdom in the king's silence for a decade. He stood near the king with the easy posture of someone who considered the space beside a throne to be simply another room in his own house. The rite proceeded as it always did. Names were called. Files were presented on small wooden tablets, passed hand to hand along the noble house's representatives, each house's banner-bearer dipping the sigil if they found no match, raising it if they wished to speak with the candidate directly. Elowen watched 4 more strays get their tablets read and rejected. She watched one boy, a sturdy young man with a farmer's shoulders, get 3 banners raised at once, and the small, unguarded joy on his face made something in her chest hurt, in a way she chose not to examine. Then the herald, an older wolf named Master Corwin, whose job this was every 7 years, and who had, Elowen suspected, grown tired of it, called her name. Elowen Vance, age 23, no house of record, ward of the Duskmere kennel since infancy. Her tablet went hand to hand. She watched the banners the way she'd watched them all morning, already knowing the shape the next few seconds would take. House Marrow's silver hawk dipped. House Calder's amber fox dipped. House Thistlewood's banner didn't even lift from where it rested against its bearer's shoulder. She kept her chin level. She had practiced this face for years, pleasant, unbothered, the face of someone for whom this was simply Tuesday. 12 houses. She had known it would be 12. She turned to go. Wait. The word cracked across the courtyard like something breaking. And the strange thing, the thing Elowen would turn over in her mind for the rest of her life, was that the voice was not loud. It was low and rough and sounded like something unused, the way a hinge sounds after a decade of rust. But every single person in that courtyard heard it, and every single person went utterly, instantly silent because the voice had come from the king. Elowen turned back. Ronan Blackwood was looking at her, not at her tablet, not at the notation of her landless, houseless, ancestorless blood. At her. Lord Draven's head snapped toward the king so fast his silver-streaked hair caught the light. "Your Grace." The king raised one hand, and Draven's mouth closed like a trap sprung empty. Ronan Blackwood descended the last 3 steps of the keep himself. Elowen had time to notice that he moved like a man carrying a weight no one else could see, and that up close his eyes were a gray so pale they looked almost silver, and that despite 10 years of silence there was nothing broken in his face, only something guarded, something held very deliberately shut, the way a person holds a door against a wind they know is coming. He stopped an arm's length from her. The whole courtyard watched. Somewhere behind her, Tansy had gone rigid with astonishment. The king did not speak again. He simply held out one hand, palm up, in the old gesture, older than the choosing rite itself, older than the 9 houses. That meant, in the wordless language every wolf in Valorn was born understanding, I claim this one, into my house. Now. The silence stretched. Elowen realized, distantly, that her own hand was shaking. Your Grace, Draven said again, and this time there was iron under the courtesy. The girl is unhoused, bloodless. There is no record of lineage past 19 years. The king turned his head. Not fast, not sharp, just enough, and looked at Draven with an expression that made the older man stop mid-sentence and, after a moment, take a single step backward. Then Ronan Blackwood looked at Elowen again, and waited, hand still outstretched, as if the entire assembled nobility of Velorn were not holding its breath around them. Elowen thought of the kennel's common room. She thought of 12 dipped banners and 19 years of blank lineage, and a whole life spent being the thing houses turned their sigils away from. She thought, whatever this is, it is not nothing. She put her hand in his. The moment their palms touched, something moved through her that had no name in any language she knew. Not pain, not quite pleasure. A current like moonlight given weight, gone as fast as it came. But not before she saw the king's pale eyes widen by a fraction so small that she was certain no one else in the courtyard caught it. He had felt it too. His fingers closed around hers, warm and careful, as though she might startle and bolt. Behind him, Lord Draven's face had gone the particular still white of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood, and above them both, the keep's ancient bells began, unbidden, to ring. No one in Velorn had heard the king's own house bells ring outside a coronation in 10 years. Elowen Vance, 23 years old, unhoused, hollow-blooded, 12 times refused, walked up the steps of Duskmere Keep, holding the hand of a king who had not spoken a single word to another living soul in a decade, and had just broken that silence for her, and no one, not even the man beside her, seemed to know exactly why. The room they gave her had windows facing the eastern ridgeline, a bed twice the size of the one she'd shared with 3 other girls at the kennel, and a silence so complete that for the first 3 nights, Elowen lay awake simply listening to it, the way a person listens for a threat. No one explained anything. A quiet, efficient woman named Mrs. Aldous, who ran the keep's household with the brisk affection of someone who'd buried more grief than she discussed, brought Elowen clothes that fit, meals that arrived on time, and precisely no answers to the question written plainly on Elowen's face every time their paths crossed. Why me? His Grace does things in his own season, Mrs. Aldous said, the 3rd time Elowen asked. He always has, since he was a boy who could still shout the roof down. You'll learn not to push at a door he hasn't opened himself. He opened one today, in front of the whole council. Mrs. Aldous's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. That he did. First one in 10 years. Give him time to tell you why or don't, and learn to live with the not knowing. Most of us here have. Elowen did not see the king again for 4 days, which gave her ample time to learn the shape of the keep's rumor mill, which turned out to be exactly as active as the kennels had been, if considerably better dressed. She learned, in fragments traded by kitchen staff who assumed a stray girl from the courtyard wasn't worth guarding their tongues around, that the king had been different once, that as a young alpha in training, he'd had a voice that could carry across a battlefield, and a laugh that servants still talked about like a lost season. That something had happened at his coronation, in the private chamber, where new kings spoke the sovereign's oath alone, before the 9 houses' witnesses. That he had gone in with his voice and come out without it, and had never once, in 10 years, explained what occurred in that room. That the Council of 9, led by Lord Draven, had assumed the regency temporarily, and that the temporary arrangement had lasted a decade, renewed at each year's Accord meeting by unanimous vote of houses that Draven controlled through debt, marriage, or fear. Elowen turned all of this over, the way she turned over everything, carefully, from several angles, the way you handle something you suspect might cut you. She met the king properly on the 5th evening, in the keep's smaller library, where she had gone hunting for something to read because sleep wasn't coming, and the silence in her new room had started to feel less like peace and more like waiting. He was already there, seated near the fire with a ledger open on his knee, and when she hesitated in the doorway, he looked up and, after a visible moment of deliberation, gestured, not toward the door, but toward the empty chair across from his. She sat. For a long time, neither of them did anything. He wrote in his ledger. She watched the fire. It should have been unbearable, and instead it was, oddly, the first entirely comfortable silence she'd sat in since arriving at the keep. Because unlike every other silence in this place, this one wasn't hiding anything from her. It simply was what it was. A man who couldn't speak, and a woman used to not being spoken to, sharing a fire. Eventually he closed the ledger, took up a fresh scrap of paper, and wrote something in a hand that was surprisingly elegant for a man rumored to have thrown, in his youth, more than one piece of furniture across more than one room. He held the paper out to her. "Why did you flinch at the courtyard when I took your hand?" Elowen read it twice. "I didn't think anyone saw that." He tapped the paper, once, patient. "It wasn't a flinch away from you," she said slowly, working it out even as she spoke it. "It was, I felt something, when our hands touched, like a current. Did you not feel it?" His pale eyes held hers for a long moment, and then he wrote again, the pen moving faster this time, less careful. "I felt it. I have not felt it since I was 9 years old, holding my mother's hand in the Ashwood orchard, the year before the old first houses fell. I did not think I would ever feel it again. I did not think it was possible from a stranger." Elowen's mouth went dry. "The Ashwood orchard," she repeated. "House Ashgrave's orchard? The house that was destroyed in the rebellion?" He nodded, watching her with an intensity that made her feel, not for the first time since the courtyard, like he was searching her face for something he already half believed was there. She thought of her lineage records, ending abruptly 19 years ago. She thought of a name, Ashgrave, that had never once, in 23 years at the kennel, been spoken in her presence, because the kennel's clerks had learned early that certain old house names were better left buried, that children with blank records did not need to be reminded of the massacre that had likely orphaned them. "I don't know my parents," she said. "I don't know anything before the kennel. I was maybe 4 when they took me in. There was no name on me. Just a blanket with a mark stitched into the corner. A leaf, an ash leaf. Though nobody ever told me that's what it was until a groundskeeper mentioned it once years ago and got scolded for saying it in front of me." The king went very still. He wrote 3 more words, and this time his hand was not steady at all. "Show me. Tonight." The blanket was the one possession Elowen had carried through every year of the kennel and every year since. Soft with age, its ash leaf embroidery faded nearly to invisibility, kept folded at the bottom of whatever bag she owned because it was the only thing in the world that had been with her longer than her own memory. She fetched it from her new room and brought it back to the library, and watched Ronan Blackwood's face as he unfolded it across his knee, with hands that had gone, she noticed, faintly unsteady. He traced the stitched leaf with one finger. Then he stood, crossed to a locked cabinet behind his desk, and withdrew a small wooden box that he handled the way a man handles something he has not looked at in a very long time. Inside was a single embroidered handkerchief, its ash leaf pattern identical, stitch for stitch, to the one on Elowen's blanket. "My mother made these," he wrote, when he'd steadied his hand enough to hold the pen. "One for every child born under House Ashgrave's protection, the year she and Lord Ashgrave signed the Sanctuary Pact, a promise that any unhoused child born in Valorn would be sheltered under Ashgrave's banner until they came of age. There is a ledger, somewhere in the old archive, of every child who received one. I have looked for it for 10 years, and never found it." "The Sanctuary Pact," Elowen said. "I've never heard of it." "Because House Draven made certain no one would." His jaw tightened as he wrote. "Ashgrave was destroyed the same year the pact was signed. Officially, a rebellion. Crushed by loyal houses, mourned as a tragedy. What I have never been able to prove, in 10 years of silence, is that the rebellion was a lie. That Ashgrave was destroyed because Lord Ashgrave discovered something about House Draven that Draven could not allow to become known. And that the Sanctuary Pact's children were meant to disappear along with the evidence." Elowen stared at the ash leaf blanket in her lap, 23 years of unanswered questions rearranging themselves into a shape she had never once let herself imagine. You're saying I might be one of those children. A sanctuary child. Maybe even Ashgrave blooded yourself, he finished on the paper, before she could say it aloud. I do not know. I have suspected, since the moment I touched your hand today, that the moon has finally answered 10 years of a question I stopped asking out loud a very long time ago. I am not able to say more than that yet. I need to be certain before I say it where Draven might hear. Why? Elowen asked, though some cold, careful part of her already suspected the answer. What does he have to do with any of this? The king's pale eyes went to the library door, closed, but not, she understood now, ever entirely trustworthy. And he wrote his answer smaller than anything before it, as if even ink could be overheard, because Alistair Draven was in the coronation chamber the day I lost my voice, and he has spent 10 years making very sure no one, including me, ever asks him why he was the only witness who survived it. Elowen sat with that for a long moment, the fire popping softly, the ash leaf blanket warm under her hands like something that had been waiting a very long time to be understood. If he finds out what you suspect, she said, what happens to me? The king's answer came slower this time, as though he were weighing each word before committing it to paper. Then he will do to you what he could not finish doing 19 years ago. Which is why, until I am certain, you are not Elowen Vance, the unhoused stray in the eyes of this keep. You are a girl I claimed on a whim at a choosing rite, nothing more, and you will let every soul in this castle believe that, including the ones you come to trust. That's a lonely way to live, she said, before she could stop herself. Something crossed his face then. Not quite a smile, but its ancestor. The shape a smile might take on a man who had forgotten the muscles for it. He wrote one more line before he banked the fire and rose to leave her to the library's quiet. I have lived it for 10 years. I find, tonight, that I mind it rather less than I did this morning. He left her there with the blanket and the handkerchief laid side by side on the table, twin leaves stitched by the same long dead hand, and Elowen understood, watching the door close behind him, that whatever had begun in the courtyard that morning had already stopped being about pity and had started being about a debt older than either of them. One that Duskmere Keep, and the silent king who ruled it, had been waiting a very long time for someone to come and collect. The summons came 11 days later, delivered by a council page in Draven livery who would not meet Elowen's eyes. Lord Alistair Draven requested the presence of the king's newly claimed ward at the Accord Chamber that afternoon, before the full Council of 9. He's never asked to see me directly, Elowen told Ronan. In the small study off the library that had become, in the past 11 days, something like a shared territory between them, a place where his ledgers and her borrowed books had begun, without either of them quite deciding it, to occupy the same table. Not once. Why now? The king's pen moved fast, his handwriting tighter than she'd yet seen it. Because I asked the keeper of records for the Ashgrave lineage archive 3 days ago, and archive requests from my hand are logged and reported to the council within a day. Draven knows I am looking. He wants to see your face when he asks you questions, because a face tells him things paper cannot. Then I'll give him nothing to read. He looked up at her, something that might have been pride flickering behind the guarded gray of his eyes, and wrote, Say only that you are a sanctuary orphan, nothing more. Do not mention the blanket. Do not mention Ashgrave by name unless he says it first. And Elowen, whatever he offers you, whatever he threatens, do not let him see that it costs you anything to refuse. The Accord Chamber was colder than the rest of the keep, its high windows facing north, its long table ringed by 8 banner chairs, and 1 empty seat at its head that had not, Elowen understood now, been occupied by its rightful king in a decade. Draven sat not in the empty throne-adjacent chair, but in the first council seat beside it, close enough to make his meaning plain to anyone who looked. He was courteous. That was, Elowen decided within the first 2 minutes, the most dangerous thing about him. A warmth in his voice that had clearly disarmed 100 rooms before this one, laid over eyes that never once stopped calculating. "My dear girl," he said. I confess I was startled by his Grace's choice at the rite. Startled and delighted. It isn't often our king shows such decisive interest in anything these days. You must understand, though, that a claiming of this kind, with no house of record behind it, raises certain questions the council is bound by ancient charter to ask. "Ask them, my lord," Elowen said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage. "Your lineage records terminate 19 years ago. Do you know why?" "No, my lord." "Do you know the name of the house that raised you before the kennel took you in?" She held his gaze. "I was an infant, my lord. I know nothing before the kennel." Something in Draven's expression eased, not quite satisfaction, but its cousin, and he leaned back in his chair as though a weight had shifted off it. "Of course. Forgive an old man his caution. The Ashgrave name still carries certain associations in this council, and there are those among us who would be uneasy at any suggestion of its blood returning to influence near the throne. Purely a formality, you understand." He had said it himself. Ashgrave. Unprompted, the way the king had predicted he might not, testing the water to see if her face would betray recognition. Elowen made herself blink, made herself look mildly confused rather than lit up with the confirmation blazing through her chest, and said only, "I don't know that name, my lord." "No," Draven agreed, watching her with eyes that had gone, for just a moment, entirely unreadable. "No, I don't suppose you would." The meeting ended shortly after, with courtesies exchanged and nothing resolved, and Elowen walked back to the library on legs that didn't feel entirely her own, turning over the single fact she'd gained. Draven feared Ashgrave blood near the throne specifically, not generally, not a superstition, a calculation. She told Ronan everything, word for word, and watched his face darken with each sentence until, by the end, his hand on the pen was shaking too badly to write clearly. He fears it because of the sovereign's oath, he finally managed. The letters jagged. The oath is not merely ceremonial. It is bound to the old magic of the first houses, Ashgrave chief among them, before the newer houses rose. A king speaks it before witnesses of first house blood, or the oath does not take, and the voice does not pass fully into him. When I went into that chamber 10 years ago, my mother's people, the last of true first house lineage in Valorn, were all dead or scattered. Only Draven stood witness. Only Draven's hand was on my shoulder when my throat closed and the words would not come. Elowen's breath caught. "You think he did something to you? In the chamber. I think he silvered the oath itself, bound a working into the ceremony that requires a first house witness's blood to undo, which is why I have spent 10 years unable to so much as ask the question aloud. The working does not merely take my voice. It takes the words needed to explain what happened to it. I did not understand why, until 11 days ago, when I felt your hand and my voice came back long enough for 4 words in a courtyard full of people. Because I'm first house blood, Elowen said slowly. Ashgrave blood. My touch. It doesn't just feel like something to you. It's a key. I believe, Ronan wrote, and underlined it twice, that you are the only living person in this kingdom who can stand beside me and let me finish the oath. I was silvered out of speaking 10 years ago. The oath that would give me the true voice, the command that could remove Draven from every seat of power he has built on my silence in a single sentence. Which means that as of this afternoon, in that chamber, you are no longer merely a curiosity to him. What am I then? You are the single greatest threat to everything Alistair Draven has spent a decade building, the king wrote, and he now knows exactly what you look like. 3 days later, the danger stopped being theoretical. Elowen woke past midnight to Mrs. Aldous shaking her shoulder, the older woman's face bone-white in the candlelight, and the news that the keeper of records, the archivist who had, at the king's quiet request, spent 11 days searching the old Ashgrave ledgers for the Sanctuary Pact's child registry, had been found dead in the archive that evening, the relevant shelf emptied, no trace of the ledger anywhere in the keep. An accident, they're calling it, Mrs. Aldous whispered. A fall from the archive ladder. His Grace doesn't believe it for a moment, and neither, child, should you. Elowen thought of Draven's calculating eyes, of a man courteous enough to ask questions he already knew the shape of, and understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that whatever quiet, careful campaign she and the king had been fighting for 11 days had just become something neither of them could afford to lose slowly. The proof that could unmask Draven and restore Ronan's voice was gone. But the girl who was herself, the last living proof of everything Draven had spent a decade hiding, was still very much alive, and by morning, she understood, the entire council would know exactly why that mattered. By morning, the council had already acted. A formal notice arrived at the library door before Elowen had finished dressing. The Council of 9, in the interest of protecting the crown from undue influence by persons of unverified lineage, had voted 8 houses to nothing, the 9th seat being the king's own silent, unvoting throne, to require that Elowen Vance be relocated to the Accord Chamber's guest wing under council supervision, pending a full inquiry into her origins. It was, Ronan wrote when she showed him the notice, hands white-knuckled around the pen, a polite word for a cage, and everyone in the keep knew it. He is moving faster than I expected, he wrote. He cannot risk you and me being alone together long enough for me to attempt the oath again, not now that he suspects what you are. If he can separate us behind council authority, he can control every hour of contact between us, and stall the inquiry indefinitely while he searches for whatever remains of your record and destroys it. Then we don't let him separate us, Elowen said. We cannot refuse a unanimous council vote outright, not without proof that would justify defying 8 houses, and our only proof burned with the archivist's ledger. But there is one thing Draven does not know I still have. He crossed to the locked cabinet and withdrew, from beneath the box that held his mother's handkerchief, a second, smaller item. A signet ring, black stone set in tarnished silver, carved with the same ash-leaf sigil that marked Elowen's blanket. My mother's ring. Ashgrave sealed it to me the night before the rebellion, when she and Lord Ashgrave still believed there might be time to protect the sanctuary children openly. It carries a working of its own, not enough to break the silvering alone, but enough joined with true Ashgrave blood to let me speak one true sentence outside a formal oath ceremony. One sentence, Elowen. I have been saving it for 10 years, waiting for a reason worth spending it on. Save it, she said immediately. If it only works once, don't waste it protecting me from a guest wing. Wait for the moment it can end this. The moment it can end this, he wrote, and for the first time since she'd known him, his handwriting had gone entirely steady, is the moment Draven is forced to stand in front of the full council with no ledger to destroy and no archivist left to silence. Which means, Elowen, that our best chance is not to hide from the inquiry he's called. It's to walk into it. They had less than a day to plan before council guards arrived to escort her to the wing, and it was in that day that Elowen learned 2 things about the man who had claimed her from a courtyard 11 days before a stranger's death. That he planned the way he wrote, careful and thorough and utterly without wasted motion, and that beneath the guarded stillness he wore like armor, there was a fury that had been banked for a decade and was, she understood now, watching him work, very close to finally being spent. Captain Fenwick Rourke, the king's oldest friend and the only member of the keep's guard whose loyalty predated Draven's regency, was brought quietly into the plan that evening. A broad, weathered man who had, Elowen gathered from the way he looked at Ronan, spent 10 years grieving a friend he could still see but no longer hear, and who received the news that the king might finally have a way to speak with an expression of such raw hope that Elowen had to look away from it. The inquiry's set for the Accord meeting in 4 days, Rourke said low, once Ronan had finished writing out the plan. Full attendance, all 9 houses, half the noble court watching from the gallery besides. Draven will have the home ground and every advantage of it, which is exactly why it has to happen there, Ronan wrote. A sentence spoken in a locked study convinces no one. A sentence spoken before the full council, at the exact moment Draven believes he has finally won, cannot be silenced, buried, or explained away by morning. He built his power on a decade of no one asking questions in public. We are going to ask one loudly, in the one room in Velorn he cannot control the exits of. Elowen looked at the ash leaf ring in the king's palm, at the 4 days standing between them and a chamber full of watching nobility, and felt something steady settle into place beneath the fear. The particular calm of a person who has spent a lifetime being underestimated, and has finally, for the first time, been handed a reason to prove exactly how wrong that underestimation was. 4 days, she said. Then let's not waste a single hour of them. The Accord chamber had never, in Elowen's 11 days at Duskmere Keep, been more than half full. On the morning of the inquiry, it was packed to its high stone walls, all 9 houses seated at the long table, the gallery above crowded with lesser nobility drawn by rumor of the king's strange new ward, and at the chamber's heart, in the first council seat beside the empty throne, Lord Alistair Draven, dressed in black and silver, looking, Elowen thought, like a man who had already rehearsed his victory. He opened the inquiry himself, as was his right as first counsel. "We gather," he said, his warm courtroom voice pitched to carry to the gallery, "not to condemn, but to protect, to ask the questions our charter demands whenever the Crown's household admits a person of unverified blood. Elowen Vance, ward of His Grace, please step forward." Elowen stepped forward. She had chosen, that morning, to wear the ash leaf blanket as a shawl, rather than fold it away. A small defiance that made Draven's eyes narrow the instant he saw the faded stitching, though he said nothing of it yet. Saving it. She understood. For the moment, it would land hardest. "You claim no knowledge of your lineage," Draven said, "and yet I understand His Grace ordered a search of the Ashgrave archive within days of claiming you. A curious coincidence, for a girl who knows nothing of that name." "His Grace's inquiries are his own, my lord," Elowen said. "I've answered every question honestly. Have you?" Draven's gaze swept the chamber, gathering its attention the way a conductor gathers an orchestra. "Then let me ask one you have not yet been asked directly. That blanket at your shoulders. Where did you get it?" "It came with me to the kennel, my lord, as an infant." "And do you know," Draven said, softer now, almost gentle, the gentleness of a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath, that the pattern stitched into its corner is the personal sigil of the last lady of House Ashgrave, a house destroyed 19 years ago for treason against the crown? That every child who received such a blanket was, by the Sanctuary Pact's own terms, sworn kin to a house this council found guilty of conspiracy and rebellion? I put it to this chamber that the king's household now harbors the bloodkin of a convicted traitor house, concealed under a claim of ignorance, and that this council has both the right and the duty to remove her from the crown's presence immediately, pending— The king rose. He had not spoken since the courtyard. 11 days of notes and gestures and a silence the whole kingdom had learned to read as permanent. And now Ronan Blackwood stood at the head of the Accord table with his mother's ring on his hand, and reached, not for a pen, but for Elowen's hand itself, closing his fingers around hers in front of the full council and half the noble court of Velorn. Draven's mouth was already moving, already reaching for the next piece of his argument, when the king spoke. House Ashgrave committed no treason. The words came out rough, cracked, 10 years unused and shaking with the effort of it, but they carried, clean and unmistakable, into every corner of the packed chamber, and the silence that followed them was of an entirely different order than any silence Duskmere Keep had held in a decade. Draven had gone the color of old parchment. "Your grace, your voice, has returned," Ronan said, each word costing him visibly, but coming steadier now, gathering strength the way a fire gathers once the first log catches. "The moment I stand beside true Ashgrave blood, wearing my mother's seal, in a chamber full of witnesses, because the working that silvered my throat 10 years ago required exactly this to be undone. First house blood. My mother's ring. And a room too full to be silenced by another quiet death in an archive at midnight." A murmur broke across the gallery, rising fast. Draven found his footing first among the council, rising with a composure that was, Elowen thought, genuinely remarkable under the circumstances. "Your Grace has clearly suffered some private grief that has clouded his judgment. This girl's presence has..." "House Ashgrave was destroyed," Ronan said, louder now, his voice filling the chamber the way Elowen understood it had not filled anything in 10 years. "Because Lord Ashgrave discovered that the man now seated as first council of this kingdom had spent a decade skimming the crown's mineral ties through falsified border accounts. And rather than allow that discovery to reach my father, Alistair Draven orchestrated a rebellion that never happened, murdered an entire house to bury the evidence, and stood alone in my coronation chamber 9 years later to silver my throat the moment he learned I intended to reopen my father's old suspicions." "Lies," Draven said, but his voice had lost its courtroom warmth entirely, gone thin and fast. "Fabrications, spoken by a man whose silence for 10 years this council generously excused as illness, now suddenly cured by the convenient touch of a stray girl he claimed on a whim." "Not convenient," Ronan said. "Correct. Ask your keeper of the Silver Accord to examine the working bound into this council's own founding charter, the clause requiring first house witness at any sovereign's oath. Ask why you alone stood witness at mine, when every first house family of standing had already been quietly removed from the rolls in the years before. Ask this chamber to consider why a man so certain of his innocence has spent 10 years ensuring the one witness who could contradict him was never permitted to speak." Lord Draven's eyes went for the first time to Elowen, not with courtesy now, not with calculation, but with the flat, cornered look of a man doing arithmetic on how many exits remained open to him. Captain Rourke, positioned near the chamber's western door exactly as planned, took one visible step forward, and 2 other house guards, Marrows, Elowen noted with some surprise, and old Thistlewoods, moved with him, less out of loyalty to the king, she suspected, than out of the particular hunger nobility gets when a rival's long dominance shows its first crack. "The archivist who was searching the Ashgrave ledgers at my request," Ronan said, into the chamber's rising noise, "died the same night the relevant shelf was emptied. I would ask this council to consider who else in this room had reason to fear what that ledger contained, and to remember that a sanctuary pact registry, once thought destroyed, has a habit, in my experience, of existing in more than one copy. It was a bluff. Elowen knew it was a bluff, had watched him decide, 2 nights before, to speak it as though it were fact, betting everything on Draven's nerve-breaking, before anyone thought to demand proof. For one endless moment, she watched it hang in the air, watched Draven's calculating mind visibly working through the odds of a bluff versus a truth he could not risk being wrong about, and then watched him make, for the first time in 10 years of careful victories, a mistake. "There is no second copy," Draven snapped. "I made certain of that myself. The night the first one..." He stopped. It was already too late. The admission sat in the chamber's stunned silence like a blade left standing in wood, and Elowen watched House Marrow's banner-bearer turn slowly to stare at the man he had followed for a decade, watched old Lord Thistlewood's face go the particular gray of a person recalculating an entire lifetime of political loyalty in a single sentence. "Seize him," Ronan said, and this time his voice did not shake at all. What followed was not, in the end, a battle. Draven was a schemer, not a fighter. and the guards who might once have moved to protect him found, in the space of that single admission, that their loyalty had evaporated faster than he could reach for it. He was taken from the chamber under council guard, his own former allies among them, shouting accusations that grew less coherent with every step, while behind him the accord chamber dissolved into the particular chaos of a court realizing, all at once, that the last decade's certainties had just come apart. It took the better part of a season to unmake 10 years of quiet theft and hidden murder, tithe records to untangle, houses to question, a sanctuary pact registry that did, in the end, exist in a second copy, hidden not in any archive, but in the false bottom of the very box that had held Ronan's mother's handkerchief, waiting, Elowen liked to think, for exactly this. It confirmed what the ring and the blanket already had. Elowen Vance had been born Elowen Ashgrave, last living child of the Sanctuary Pact, saved as an infant by a nursemaid who had died protecting her and never told a soul, leaving only a stitched leaf and a lifetime of unanswered questions in her place. Draven stood trial before the reconstituted council, Marrow and Thistlewood, and 6 other houses that had rediscovered, with his fall, an appetite for governing honestly, and was stripped of his house, his seat, and his name. Exiled to the northern territories where kings less inclined toward mercy than Ronan Blackwood might well have simply ended the matter with a blade. "You could have," Elowen said to him, the evening after the sentencing, the two of them alone in the library where all of this had truly begun, 11 days, now a season, before. No one would have questioned it. Ronan's voice was still finding its full strength, still occasionally rough after a decade of disuse, but it no longer cost him the way it had in the accord chamber. "I spent 10 years silent, because a man decided my voice was inconvenient to his ambitions. I will not spend the rest of my reign proving him right about what silence makes a person capable of." She smiled at that, and found, watching him, that the guarded stillness she'd first seen descending the keep's steps had softened into something else entirely. Not the boy the old kitchen stories remembered, not quite, but someone reaching, carefully, toward becoming him again. The council formally restored House Ashgrave's name and lands within the month, an emptied and lonely inheritance in some ways. Orchards gone wild, a manor long stripped of its furnishings, a title with exactly one living heir to claim it. 12 noble houses had refused Elowen Vance at a choosing rite, because her blood carried no name worth claiming. She stood now, months later, in that same courtyard, as Elowen Ashgrave, lady of a restored first house, with the Alpha King of Vaylorn beside her, the same man who had once crossed a silent decade to reach for her hand when every other house in the kingdom had turned its banner away. "They'll ask why you chose me," she said, watching the courtyard where the rite had happened, now filling with ordinary morning traffic, servants and merchants who had no idea what that ground had witnessed. "The whole kingdom will ask it for years." Ronan took her hand. No current of strange magic now, just warmth, familiar and chosen, and said, in a voice that had spent months relearning how to be steady, "Let them ask. I have an answer, finally, and I intend to spend the rest of my reign giving it to anyone who wonders." Every house in Vaylorn looked at an unhoused girl and saw nothing worth claiming. I looked, and saw the only voice in 10 years worth breaking my silence for. Above them, for the first time since a coronation gone wrong a decade before, the keep's bells rang out over Duskmere not in mourning or warning, but in something that sounded, to everyone who heard it that morning, remarkably like joy.